Hey, this is Todd, and I'm here with a board game night recap of my play and win of the game Dominare. I hadn't heard of Dominare before. It's not a new game. I think the person who brought it said it was 6 or 7 years old. Apparently, it takes place in the same universe as Love Letter, which in this case was a faux Renaissance Italian city. This is what I would consider, I guess, a Euro style game. It's area control with some tableau building, some drafting mixed in. I sort of had to be convinced to join the game because looking at the board, it's not very flavorful. It's a abstract view of this, again, faux Italian city with a canal that's running through it and several areas that are marked. The Athenaeum was one, the Senate was another, some places they called the swamps, a merchant quarter, the church, and each one of those was gridded, some grids having numbers, which indicated how many points those squares would be worth during the end of game scoring. Others were blank. Some of them even had negative points. A tracker, a couple of trackers around the board, one of which was a turn tracker. And just while I'm thinking about it, I like the turn tracker because not only did it give you the turns, it tracked the phases within the turns, which is important. And I know a lot of games, you'll have the turn tracker, but then you have to remember to look on some other cheat sheet about what happens in each turn or some other thing to tell you. This one, it had it all there. So you could just move the marker. It was set in seasons, and there were 7 seasons, so 7 turns. Within that turn, several phases. And so you could move the marker down each phase so you could look at a glance and recognize where you were and what was going on. It seemed complicated when the guy was explaining it to me, but actually in play, it was fairly simple. What you do is you get a list of cards, and these are all... So I guess let me back up. The theme of the game is that you are leading a conspiracy, or every player is leading a conspiracy to take over leadership of this city. So what you're doing is you are drafting and building a tableau of your conspirators, these agents that you put out on the table who have powers. Some powers will happen as soon as you play them. Some powers will happen depending on where they are in your tableau, and therefore also the season, since you can only place one at a time. And those powers are having you spread influence around the board, which is putting down wooden blocks, colored blocks on these spots. And depending on what type of agent they are, they can only put their blocks in certain places. So they'll usually have keywords. One might be Senate, which means they'll have a symbol as well, which means they can place their units on the Senate, but not in other squares. And each one will have powers. So you go through, and they'll also have gold attached to them and also exposure, which, going back to the idea of the conspiracy, is the more powerful your agents, the more it becomes public that something's going on. And that's bad for you because there's an event phase, and when events come, they tend to hammer at whoever has the most exposure, who they call the scapegoat. And also at the end of the game, the scapegoat will lose points depending on how much exposure they've built up. So you generally don't want to be the scapegoat. Where the scapegoat can help, or at least not be totally harmful, is that it's also measures you as the first player. So whoever the scapegoat gets to go first in each phase. So you can get out in front and do some things, but it also means that the rest of the table gets to react to you. And there are a lot of negative implications. You're getting a deck, you're getting a hand of these cards. And the cards is really where all the flavor and theme really come out. They have these great pseudo-Italian names, and the art on there is very pretty. Gives you the layout of their abilities and when you can use them. That's where really all the flavor of the game comes in, because the board is very dry. And I remember looking at it last night and thinking, oh my gosh, this just looks like math, the game. But once you start looking at your characters and you're sussing out which one you want to use and how you can lay them out, because how you lay them out in your tableau is also important. So as you go through the phases, you play cards, but where they are is as important as who they are. So each card will have powers, and those powers will have numbers on them. And those numbers will correspond to where they are in your tableau. So the card that you play first, that comes out in that first position, can only use their power that's marked 1. If they have a power marked 5, they can't use it, or 3, they can't use it. If you want to use their power marked 3, they have to be in the 3rd spot in your tableau. So there's a lot of strategy about which cards you play where. If you play a card in the wrong spot, they may be useless. Some cards will have really good powers, but their powers are in different spots. So you may look at one, it's got a power on 2 and on 4. And the power on 2 looks really good, but the power on 4 looks even better. But can you wait? You may feel like you need to put that card down in the 2 spot because you may not have any other good choices, or maybe it's really good for you right now. Or do you try to basically get more agents into your deck to give you more choices to see if you can wait and hold out for that spot. Now, all of us playing were new. We played a 4-player game. All of us were new, except for the guy who taught us the rules. And so there was a lot of, we don't know the cards, we don't know the powers, we don't know the synergies. So there was a lot of guesswork going on. I think we all played very suboptimal games. I ended up concentrating a lot on the Senate because the first card I put down was a Senator. And so that's where you're putting your cube. So during the phases are one, it's you put the person down. And each person puts down who they have. And then you go through another phase where they have basically some amount of influence that comes with them, and you can put that in their area. So I had the Senator, and I think she had an influence of 3, so that I take 3 cubes and I can put them on the Senate. And then other people may have one for the church, and someone else may have one for the Senate, whatnot. So you're putting them down. Then there'll be a part where you look at their exposure and you move the exposure track around and figure out who's the new scapegoat. And this is after the event. I think it goes, you add to your tableau, then you do the event, then you do the exposure. I might have those reversed. Then you do 2 times around, except for the last turn, you do their abilities. And again, you go around the board. So it's not that you get to do all your abilities at once. You'll do one ability, you go around the board, you do another ability, you go around the board. Some of those abilities are things just putting cubes here, taking someone's cubes away, doing something like that. Some of them can be basically turning one of your agents inactive. And once an agent is inactive, you flip it on the other face so that the details of the agent are hidden. And those don't come back until either you have a power that allows you to flip it back, or you use one of your actions to flip your cards back. So it's not as simple as, I'm just going to lose this guy for 1 round. You're going to lose them until you use one of your actions to flip it back. So it could be a very powerful ability. You could see someone who maybe has something coming up, hit that on them. It can really cause a lot of problems, because if they were depending on that being, say, their first move, now they can't do it unless they have some other ability they can use. And then they have to figure out, well, is it worth my while to spend 1 action and not do anything else on the board so I can get this guy back? Or is it worth me just struggling along without that guy? And the other thing is, when it's flipped over, you don't get any of the benefits from their influence or anything else. So when you're going through that first part of the game where you're going through all your agents and placing their cubes down, if you have a guy that's flipped over, you just get bypassed. So it hurts on multiple levels. You lose their actions, but you also lose that influence. And I know that I had a guy that was really looking forward to playing. I forget who played. It was either I think it might have been an event, and I happened to have been the scapegoat at the time, caused me to flip that guy over. And I don't think I got to use his ability the entire game, because by the time I was able to get in, flip back over, the time for that ability had sort of passed. And it didn't end up hurting me because I ended up winning the game, but it was definitely something where I kept trying to figure out in my mind each time these actions came up, should I use that action to flip them? No, I won't. It ended up being, I think, the second to last round. I didn't have a lot going on. I actually thought I was in a really bad spot. And I was looking over my actions that I had available to me, and I had another guy who'd gotten flipped over. I think I might have had 2 or 3 cards were flipped at this point. And I just thought, well, let me just spend that action and flip them back over. And so it ended up helping me, because in that last round, I had access to all my agents with all their influence to shore up my position in a couple of places. But it was definitely gave you decisions to do. And so you have the actions you can take on the cards. You have these different things you can do. You can use an action to flip guys over. You can use an action to get some money. You can use an action to try to recruit a couple more agents. If you control areas, meaning you have the most cubes in a spot, you control it, and then they have each one of those will have a power that you can use. So if you control the Senate, you get the Senate card. The Senate card has a power. I forget what it is. You can use that. There's a lot of take that type play, because I'm putting my cubes on the Senate. Someone can put their cubes in the same block, and basically it's like an attack. If I have 3 cubes on the spot, they decide to play 4 cubes on that same spot. I lose my 3. They put 1 cube left. You subtract the greater number, you leave it. So there was a lot of, you're putting some cubes down, you're putting it back. And I know in the early rounds for me, I don't know what it was, but people just kept hammering me in the Senate. I would put some cubes down there, and then someone would come in and just start wiping me out. And what worked in my favors was I had an actual senator agent, and it was not until almost the late game that a couple of other people got senator agents. So they were spending money as another action you could do. You could spend money to place influence. So they were having to exhaust their resources to try to block me there. But I'm not sure why they were blocking me there, because there were other areas that were more in demand, or were sort of, people were able to build up these little strongholds, these other areas in the map. And I felt like it was ignored because people were just hammering at me for whatever reason. But towards the end of the game, that switched. And I don't know if that helped me, because there actually are a lot of points locked into the Senate. And so let me get into the scoring to sort of explain how that works. If you have the most cubes on a section, there are these trackers on another part of the board that tell you how many victory points you get for controlling that section. And it fluctuates. It's kind of a neat mechanic. There are certain cards that will allow you to move their value up or down. One of the things that if you are the scapegoat and there is an event, on the side of event, there'll be two choices, and that basically will give you a number and a type of space. And it can allow you to set that to either move up or down the value of those spaces. So what happened with me is, again, people were hammering me in the Senate, and they just drove I think the value of the Senate starts at 4, but in the game it was at 1, because they just took it down. Me not really knowing what I'm doing. I think I had maybe one card I could use to try to raise the value of the Senate back up, but I kept thinking if I raise it up, someone's just going to hammer it down again, and they're just going to keep pestering me, so I'm going to leave it alone. Another player was smart. Towards the end of the game, she was raising up the value of these spots that she kind of had control of, but she made a mistake, and I was able to capitalize on it. As one of these spaces that she'd ramped up the value pretty well on, she had very little coverage. She had only had 3 spaces on it, but she only had 2 cubes in one spot, and then the other 2 spaces only had 1 cube each. So actually part of what I did was I'm looking around, and I thought to myself, the Senate is blown out. I also controlled the church, and they had reduced the value of that to nothing. So I'm looking around I had thought that controlling those places would be where I would get the most of my victory points. So I'm looking around thinking, where can I look? And I look at the side, and I remembered, because she had raised the value of this. It was like 6 or 7. And she had very little coverage, and I had some cards to play. So I was able to move some of my cubes over there. And I didn't have a lot of agents with affiliations with the swamp, so I had to use different abilities that allowed me to put influence anywhere, because a lot of them are limited. A lot of them say, you can only put influence in the Senate. You can only put influence in the church. It's other place. Though you'll get some other powers that'll say, hey, you can put them anywhere that's not the church or anywhere that's outside the Senate. So I had a couple of those. So I was able to knock her out of one of those spots and put some guys in there so that we were tied. She had 3 cubes on there between her 2 spaces, and on my space, I had 3 cubes. So at that point, I think neither one of us would have gotten that victory point because it was contested. So then comes in the last round, and one of the guys decides, I'm not sure why, to maybe, because I don't think any of us had a sense of who was winning. So I don't think people saw I'm ahead and they're knocking me. But he decided to take one of my cubes off. And so I'm sitting there, and I needed basically 2 cubes to take the victory points. And at that point, I was second to last in the order. So by the time it came back around to me, the player who was controlling had already gone, and she had no powers to help her. So she was finished. And the person after me, I don't think they had no way of blocking me. And I don't think they'd really had it in their mind, because I don't think anyone had seen yet. We hadn't gone through the scoring. It wasn't really clear, I think, to anyone that I was winning, or that I might have even been close to winning. So I actually found that the actions you get through controlling areas are pretty situational and kind of weak. But in this one hand, the church one, that I had lost control of the church earlier in the action phase, but I still controlled it as far as the card, since that control card doesn't move until basically the beginning of the next round. So since this was the last round, I still had control of it, even though someone had actually taken control of the church away from me earlier. And the church one said, hey, put 2 cubes anywhere outside the church. So I'm looking around, I'm trying to figure out, and I thought to myself, the only way I'm going to win this or even be close is if I can get those 7 points. So looking around, and I think, okay, I think she had 3. I had 2, but this one let me put 2. I put my 2 there, 4 points, took control of it. And I think after the game, she told me that she was kind of kicking herself a little bit because she realized too late that she had raised up the value of this place and not really fortified it. So when I actually did the scoring, I think I had 21 points and the next person had 11. That one swing was about a 7-point swing. So I think if given the other player those 7 points taken away from me, she probably would have won. It might have been close game, but I think I would have lost by a few points. So that ended up being a big swing. I didn't walk into this thinking it was a game I would enjoy, but I did have a good time. I sort of started it begrudgingly because there was not much else going on, and the guy was explaining it, and I felt like they were kind of looking for that 4th player. And I think, well, I'm here to play games, so let me play games, so I'll play. But I did end up enjoying it. I do think that the theme is not terribly connected to the mechanics. We're playing conspiracies, and yet there's very little secrecy going on. All our guys are basically visible. Once you put them in your tableau, they're visible for anybody to see. Now, given that you're playing at a table and we're not intimately familiar with all the cards, I don't really know what that person has, but you can certainly see where their influence is going to be. All it takes is a glance to see that I had 3 or 4 senators at one point, or to see what someone else is doing. So that part doesn't feel particularly conspiratorial. I think you could wipe out, it's one of those games, where you could wipe the theme away and just have it abstract, and it would still pretty much play the same. I do think the cards add a lot of that theming, and they are fun, all the different names and titles and little blurbs about them are nice, but I would have liked a little bit more. I think ultimately, for me, theme up the board a little bit more. Don't make it so abstract. Maybe have it where it feels more like you're playing conspiracy. I felt it was almost more like you were playing politics, which is basically what the conspiracy is, but you're doing it in a public way. If you're, say, forming coalition government, you're trying to get different factions on your side. That's what this felt like to me. Something that's not so much private, hush-hush, as you're doing this sort of public influence. The other thing you think about a conspiracy is maybe you get a double agent, you can get somebody to turn, but none of your agents can turn. They can be killed in a sense. You can be forced to discard them, or they can be flipped so that they're useless, but there's no concept of saying, oh, I see you had bought off that senator, but I'm going to buy them away from you. And granted, that's just not part of the game, but these are things that would have maybe helped lend it a little bit more of, you're playing it as a conspiracy as opposed to you're playing an area control. I mean, this could have easily been a combat type thing where my square cubes were troops and I'm moving them in, destroying them. There was nothing that spoke particularly to it being a conspiracy. So this one had 7 seasons. Each season is broken down into several steps, 2 actions for each one, 3 actions in the last round. And that works well. And I think that having that ordered, each one of your little mini turns, so each one of your phase turns, if you have one, say, seasonal round, each one of your turns within the round goes by fast, and you quickly learn what you need to do, and it's easy to go around the board. Now, it's not so easy as going around in a circle, and several times we had the wrong person start to go before we realized that we had to switch the order, because you go from this exposure down, from the scapegoat who's got the most exposure down the list. So that changes more or less every round, because each agent you're playing, except for some of them I don't think have any exposure, but most of them have some exposure. And you can play cards to reduce your exposure. You can also play cards to raise somebody else's exposure. So the exposure is changing all the time. And so whose turn it is in a round can kind of ping pong around depending on what, which season it is. So you might have been going first. Now you're going third, then you're going second. Be a little confusing, but there's another tracker on the board which helps you track all that, but it's a little bit confusing. But I understand the point to it, and it makes sense. I think that the other thing I thought was that some of the powers seem really, really strong. And I read I just went on Board Game Geek and I looked at some of the reviews and things about it. And some of the powers towards the end of the game, I think can be maybe a little bit overpowering. Again, we were all newbies, never played it before. I did a terrible job of holding on to season powers or late tableau number powers, because they can go up all the way up to 7. And the ones that are 6 and 7 can be really strong. But I didn't know what I was doing on some of these. I was trying to draft ones I could use, but I misunderstood the rule at first about that turn order. I thought it was season number rather than where they were in the tableau. So I put people in a couple of spots at the beginning that I wouldn't have if I had known that they were limited by where they were in the tableau versus where we were in the season. Since you get 7 agents, ultimately, you have 7 seasons. So I kind of had a little confusion on that. And when halfway through the game, you get to draft a bunch more agents, I didn't get any with any really good 6 or 7 powers. I didn't have any of those ones that were really going to change my fortunes or change the fortunes on the board. Another player got one that had a really strong 7 power, but he couldn't hold on to it, and he felt like he had to play it for, I think it's turn season 5 or turn 5 power. And I think at the end he was kicking himself for not holding on to it for that round 7 power. But you get into a spot where you feel like you're falling behind and you got to fix it. I think if there was something that going in, if I was going to play it again, would be to really treat the early rounds as more, you're sort of sending out your feelers. It ended up working out for me because I got in the Senate early and I held on to it basically the entire game. Even though different players came in to try to knock me down a bit, they were never able to move me off the Senate. And I always had enough influence coming into the Senate. And frankly, but I think I got a little bit tunnel vision where they kept knocking me down. I kept wanting to make myself more formidable there. So I ended up having a ton of influence there. And that ended up being a lot of points for me, even though points for controlling the Senate was only 1 at the end of it because they knocked it down. But on the Senate block, and I think I would definitely look more closely at the board, there was lots of squares, 3, and I think there are 2 3s and two 2s and 2 1s. And even though the Senate was only worth 1 point, I had all those scoring squares on lockdown. So it ended up giving me about 10 points before I even looked at the who controlling the whole one. So it was a lot of points, and I might not have gone that way if people weren't just seemingly to force my hand. I just felt like that was my turf. I felt like I was locked out of the other places because I didn't have agents that were good there. So I was in the Senate. I was going to stick to the Senate. I was going to hold it come hell or high water, and I did. Ended up working out for me. But I think in another game with other players, I think that tunnel vision probably would have cost me, as I would have spent way too many resources trying to lock down the Senate and ignoring a lot of the other pieces. But I lucked out because I said that other player, she tried to kind of sneak in, locking down another area with not a lot of influence and raising up its value, and I was able to swoop in at the end and grab it. And I think that's what a lot of those late game powers do, is these areas that are weak, because there are some that'll say, hey, in every district, take 3 influence and drop it down in 3 spots. So you get to pound a lot of influence in there. If people have put a lot of their influence in, it's probably not going to change the balance of power that much at the end. I had so many people, so much influence in the Senate, that kind of card in the Senate would not have changed the balance of power. Maybe you would have knocked me out of one of the scoring squares, but I had like 15 influence, and I think I had 20 influence in 4 squares. So you weren't knocking me out of there with that kind of power, unless everybody had one and coordinated and whatever, but then probably nobody would have controlled the Senate. So that kind of power wasn't going to affect me, but it would have affected some other places where people had spread out really thinly. And because I think we were all new and not quite sure how to use powers, and some of us didn't have, like me, I just didn't have coverage in some of those other zones. They were sort of getting away with that. One of those comes in, could totally have changed those parts of the board. So we didn't have to deal with them because none of them really got played. So it's something that may come out in different games. But I think if you're able to strategize, I'm not sure, I guess, ultimately, if I think it's overpowered or not. But again, I've only played it once. So I probably don't know what I'm talking about at this point. But I didn't feel like if that card had come out that I would have been, oh my gosh, what's happened? It just would have changed the game. But, you have other rounds. And if they're the scapegoat and they're going early, you have a chance to do something to react to that. Or I had an ability I didn't use where I could flip a card of a type down. Maybe I look at his card and I know that 7's coming. And this is where you get into knowing the cards and the abilities. If I knew this guy was coming and he had 7, I could try to flip his card down and force at least that player that if they're going to use that badass ability, they're going to have to spend one of their turns flipping it up again. One of their actions, rather, to flip it up. So they would have paid for that, basically losing one of their final 3 actions just to get that card back. So there are responses you can do, but it's probably going to be who you're playing with, what sort of game you're playing. I'm not sure if this is a game that I would buy for myself. I can't see being able to get people who aren't into these kind of games to play. I just don't think it's strong enough on the theming. I think I could get, say, my wife or some of the more casual people I know into a game about the Italian Renaissance. If you took that board and made it more thematic, and instead of using the Love Letters universe, which I've played Love Letters once, none of my friends outside, the board gaming shop, board gaming night, my wife running, they don't know, never played Love Letters. It's not meaningful to them. But I think if you took say Venice, because it's got canals, or you took Milan, or you took one of these city-states from the Renaissance and you threw the Medici's and whatever in there, and you took real names you put in there, even though that we're not necessarily historians of Renaissance Italy, I think if you give that a different feel, I feel like it would be easier to draw people in. I think the theme, a little bit as far as it relates to Love Letters, maybe it holds it back a little bit. Maybe it just doesn't help it. I don't know if you're a big Love Letters fan that you're going to like this, because they seem to be really different games. To me, it's not, hey, you love Love Letters, so go ahead and try Dominare. It's kind of like if you like both sorts of games and you want to, I don't know, support that universe. I'm not sure what the deal is. I'm not sure if it's still in print. I don't know how well it did. I think it's one of those games that, reading on Board Game Geek and talking to the guy who brought it, is maybe a little underrated. I think you play it, I think it is enjoyable. And I'm not someone who plays a lot of those types of games, and I definitely enjoyed it. You can definitely get into trying to work your influence, really just shuffling your cubes around. I think I would have liked, as I said before, a little bit more of the feel of influence and the feel of conspiracy. Just give it more of that. What makes this a conspiracy as opposed to just shuffling cubes around? But it was a good time. I did enjoy it. I would say that if you like games that are area control, mix in some card play with drafting and tableaus, and you don't mind the fact that there is going to be a lot of antagonism between players as you're constantly fighting for influence and moving influence around. And really, the game forces you to do that because each of your agents works in different zones. You're going to find that you have access to certain zones for influence, and other players will too. So it forces you to go head to head. But if you don't mind that, if it's not going to frustrate you, then I think this is definitely a game to check out if you can find it at a board game night like I did, or maybe somewhere in your local friendly gaming shop. Give it a look. If you enjoy videos like these, please consider subscribing to my YouTube channel. It helps me out a lot. I also have a Patreon if you'd like to support the show in a different way. Thanks for watching.